how the culture is changing, I hope, or at least how much awareness of these topics has begun to change. So because a lot of you have already covered today a lot of the essential kind of practical topics, we'll get to just get a little bit more deep into kind of some of the big picture elements of neurodiversity and neurodiverse justice to kind of wrap your day up. My little keynote here, my little set of slides and what I have to talk about should be about, 45 minutes. Please feel free to pepper in questions in the chat throughout, and I'll try to keep an eye on both, or kind of take things up as it makes sense to, and dive into what I can with the time we have left as well. So I'll just tell a little bit about my personal story of why I am passionate about this work, and just how my relationship to finding out I was autistic kind of emerged and evolved. Talk a little bit about what autism really is versus what most of us have been told all of our lives that it is, and how that plays into masking and the erasure of marginalized autistic people. And then we'll talk about neurodiversity as a movement and what it really stands for and means, even though I think by now I'm sure many of you are very well versed in it. And then talk a little bit about neurodiverse justice, and what, beyond your individual workplace and some of these accommodations that you've already reviewed and talked about today, what are some of the long-term goals we as a shared movement might need to be looking towards. And of course, I'm seeing some of the chats from people who've already read the book and listened to the book, so some of you already know a lot of these, so apologies for covering ground that you've already heard, but hopefully we'll get into some good discussion coming from it. So my journey is that I did not know I was autistic growing up. I just knew I was weird and disaffected, and I learned from a very young age that I wasn't good at people, but I was good academically. I was good at faking things. I was, there was a lot I could do with my mind, even if there wasn't a lot I could do physically with my body or socially with other people. So I really leaned into defining myself by my accomplishments. And that's largely what my first book, Laziness Does Not Exist, is about. But I was really productivity and achievement focused in my early life because I was autistic and I didn't realize it yet. And I had picked up this sense that I can't count on other people to be there for me. I can't envision a well-connected, happy life for myself where I'm part of a robust support network. And so I'm going to need to achieve a lot of things and do everything on my own and be as impressive as possible to kind of earn my right to exist. And where that landed me was I finished my PhD at 25 years old, and immediately after finishing my PhD, I became really physically sick and really burnt out. I had a fever, 103-degree fever, every single night from February of that year all the way through to November of that year. I had a heart murmur, really severe anemia, had tons of medical tests, heart scans, blood tests, all these things, and it couldn't really be pinned down to any diagnosable condition medically, other than just exhaustion and working too hard. That was eventually how I kind of cracked the code and started getting better. And part of that getting better process for me was giving up on the hope of being a tenure track professor. So that picture on the left there, that's me at my PhD graduation. I was absolutely miserable that day. I was crying in between my mom trying to take photos of me that I didn't want her to be taking because I hated people taking my photo. I didn't know how to make myself smile. It was always just this deeply uncomfortable experience for me. And I was also physically exhausted and just swept up also in this existential dread of what is my life? Why did I do all of this stuff? This accomplishment that I thought would bring me security in life has just, it's just done now. And now I'm just looking out into the future with no sense of who I am and what I'm about. It was around the same time during this year of exhaustion and kind of existential dread and all of these problems that a cousin of mine who was in college kind of took me aside at a family gathering and mentioned that he had been having trouble adjusting to college and was really finding it overwhelming and really difficult to relate to people at college, and he had gotten assessed for autism. And me being a PhD in psychology, he assumed I knew a lot about autism, and I knew almost nothing about it. I kind of told him oh yeah, I only know about, little, nonverbal kids who, you know, the stereotypes. I just parroted back to him the most simplistic stereotypes of autism, because that's, despite having a PhD, that was all my training covered, and that's all I knew about what autism was. He already knew more about it than me, just from having gone through the assessment process and doing a little bit of research. And he started pointing out to me how so many members of our family had autism spectrum traits, being really lovers of routines. And our grandpa was like famously a huge info dumper. He could just talk your ear off about the things he was passionate about and could not tell that you were bored to tears that he was doing it, and just various other traits throughout the family. And that got me, you know, thinking about myself and what I was going through. And it really put me on the path, which was a years-long path of learning more about autism, getting to know autistic adults, diving really deeply into the research literature about what autism really is, and the massive gaps that are in that research literature, and eventually finding out that I was autistic myself. And for me, and we'll get to some of this in later slides, this coincided with a lot of big changes in my life. Embracing that I was autistic meant embracing that a conventional 9 to 5 or longer kind of work schedule was never going to work for me, that a conventional career path in academia was never going to work for me. I couldn't be a tenure track research professor. It was too grueling. There was too much just inauthenticity involved in that work. And also that being cisgender was not for me either. So forging a more authentic path as an out trans person, as an autistic person, and as someone whose life wasn't as defined by their productivity. These were all things that kind of fell into place together for me at the same time once I started finding out that I was autistic. So that was many years in the making, and that's really what this book and my work today is kind of a culmination of. You all have talked about neurodiversity a lot today, but as my story kind of illustrates, and I think a lot of our experiences who are neurodiverse, our experiences illustrate that we often didn't grow up knowing what autism was, and everyone around us, our care providers, teachers, therapists, most people that we encountered who could have potentially seen that we were in need of additional support and accommodation, had a very narrow view of what autism was as well. So let's talk about what autism is and what it isn't, and why we have such a limited view in our culture of what autism is, and such a kind of narrow stereotypic view. So here are the media stereotypes of autism that many of us are very familiar with, though these span a couple of generations. So we have Sheldon Cooper from Big Bang Theory, we have Rain Man, we have The Good Doctor, and then we have in the bottom right, this is the oldest reference. There was a soap opera, Saint Elsewhere, that on the final episode of the final season, they basically revealed that the entire soap opera had been imagined in the mind of a nonverbal autistic boy staring into a snow globe. So this is depictions of autism that span many decades, but there are a lot of commonalities, which if you've seen any of these media, or even just looking at these guys, you can see some of the commonalities, right? They're all white, they're all cisgender, they are all from middle class or higher backgrounds, generally speaking. Generally, they are stubborn, cold, don't understand people, they're good at math, or they have some savant-like abilities, such as medicine, that kind of, in the eyes of the viewer, justifies their existence as a disabled person. They're useful in some way because they're intelligent. Rain Man being the most clear-cut example of this, where he is disabled and is in an institution, but the only reason he gets out of the institution is because he's useful to his abled younger brother. And these are really all very prevailing stereotypes of autism that have been with us for decades. So let's just run down what some of those traits are. Again, like I said, lack of interest in other people, self-absorbed and selfish, blunt, obsessive about a very narrow range of subjects, very easily agitated or disturbed by any kind of changes in their environment, inflexible with regard to routine and environment and stimuli, and stubborn, emotionally cold, flat affected, unempathic, and usually having a monotonous, unexpressive voice, uncaring, unconcerned with other people, awkward, unsettling, off-putting, maybe even creepy, unlikable, adept at science and math, generally speaking, which is often presented as the one kind of justification for tolerating them, and fundamentally disconnected from the world. And the St. Elsewhere example there is perhaps the most profound one, where you just get this depiction of a nonverbal autistic person as just not existing in the world or relating to other people, only living in their head. And as I already said, these characters are almost invariably white, straight, male, cisgender male, and upper middle class. And these media stereotypes are not coincidental. They've happened for a reason. And we can see that by looking at the very history of how autism was defined as a disability and a disorder. So on the upper right there, we have Hans Asperger and Leo Kanner, who are two psychiatrists who, independently of each other in the US and then in Germany, were really describing autism generally by focusing on white boys from wealthy or upper middle class families, and generally describing their disability in terms of how it looked from the outside, and how either it was a hassle to the family of that autistic child, or in Hans Asperger's case, how some autistic people, if they're intelligent enough, can be useful to other people, and useful in his case to the Nazi regime. And that was built into whose symptoms, quote unquote, of autism were described, which patients were profiled and written up in case studies, and how the traits of autism and what for many years was known as Asperger's, how they were seen to present, was how it looks in white boys from these wealthy families, or white boys who have certain skills that could perhaps be justified, in Asperger's case, to basically isolate a certain subpopulation of autistic people. The kind of little professors is what Asperger's called them, these kind of like intelligent, skilled autistic kids who Asperger really presented as worth being spared by the Nazi regime because they could be of use to the Nazi regime. And we also have the work of Ivar Lovaas, who I have a quote there from on the bottom. Ivar Lovaas in the mid-20th century created ABA therapy, or applied behavioral analysis, which was and still is the only insurance approved treatment for autism in kids. He is also the creator of anti-gay conversion therapy. And both with anti-gay conversion therapy and ABA, Ivar Lovaas was setting out to take autistic children or take gay children and make them conform, train them more or less like animals to behave in a more socially appropriate way, so they wouldn't be a hassle or an embarrassment to their families. And Ivar Lovaas even said that autistic children are not people, that they look like people, but they are not people in the psychological sense. And that history, that looking at autistic people from the outside in terms of the hassle that we supposedly cause others, has permeated how the public, and to this day, how psychiatrists and psychologists view the disability. One really strong illustration of this is the fact that sensory issues, if you're on the spectrum, you know sensory issues are one of the biggest barriers to having a comfortable life. Most work environments are really, on a sensory level, very painful to be in. Most public spaces are just really overloading and overwhelming for a lot of autistic people. Even though it's a really definitional, in my mind, experience of being autistic in the world, one of the top things I would say if I was trying to explain to someone what autism is, psychiatrists and psychologists didn't even know autistic people had sensory issues until around the mid-'80s, when people like Temple Grandin, who of course is autistic herself, began writing and began having a little bit of a public platform and started talking about how sensory issues feel. And this is something that Steve Silberman talks about in his book, Neurotribes, which is also a really excellent history of the neurodiversity movement. So that tells you, we were missing a lot as a psychological community by only viewing autistics from the outside, rather than listening to how we would actually describe our experiences, feelings, and struggles. So if that's the lens of what autism is that we're often told, what is autism really? The best way to sum up the many, many traits and neurodivergences and variances that we see in autism that I found, it comes from an account on Twitter called the Autisticats, and they really talk about autism as being defined by bottom-up processing. And as I go into in my book, there's a lot of neurological descriptive research that kind of bears this out. So most non-autistic people, speaking very broadly, are top-down processors. If you're non-autistic and you enter a party that you've never been to before, first of all, from the second you get the invitation for the party, you have this top-down view of, I have an overall sense of what kind of party this is, and that influences what I'm going to wear, what time I'm supposed to arrive, how I'm going to act when I enter the room, and I'm going to kind of intuitively figure a lot of this stuff out. I might have social anxiety, I might have things that make going to a party hard, but there are aspects of understanding that social environment and processing it that I have a good schema, I have a good rule of thumb for how it works. Generally speaking, autistic people instead process that entire experience from the bottom up. We're not taking anything for granted, and we don't have this overarching, forest. We're looking at the trees. So it wasn't until my late 20s, for example, that I realized if you get invited to a party at someone's house, you're not supposed to show up at the time that they tell you the party's starting. You're supposed to be there like an hour or two later than that for some reason. I had to just do detective work and piece together from numerous bad party experiences that this is what's actually expected of you. This is true with how autistic people process faces and emotions. We notice the small micro expressions and the small muscle movements on a person's face, and we have to piece those things in a bottom-up fashion to conclude, oh, this person's sad, oh, this person's angry, oh, this person's hard to read, I'm going to assume the worst. Whereas many non-autistic people instead, again, have a top-down view. They just know this person's sad, this person's being sarcastic, and I don't need to break down the evidence of why, I just know. And I have this intuition, which of course intuition can often be wrong, which we'll get into, but that's how, generally speaking, holistics experience the world. This is also why we see sensory issues being such a big deal in autism. Non-autistic brains are very good at filtering out that side conversation in the corner of the party that you're not concerned with, the music that you don't really like, but the bass is buzzing and it's kind of annoying, but your brain actually, the neurons become less excitable over time. So you notice that sound less and less over time, and you just adjust to it. Autistic brains, it's the exact opposite. We have hyper-excitable neurons. We don't go through what's called sensory adaptation. So annoying background sounds become more physically painful to us the longer we're exposed to them. And we don't filter out background noise from any of our five senses. We're taking it all in and have to process all of it. And that's why it's very easy for us to get overwhelmed by fluorescent lights and people's cologne and background noise and visual stimuli on the walls and everything else. And that's also why part of being out amongst people is so exhausting in public. The reality of autism also is that we're an incredibly diverse community. So we have Hannah Gatsby here, who is an autistic comedian and lesbian, Wentworth Miller, who is an autistic gay biracial man. He's an actor. He's Captain Cold on Legends of Tomorrow and The Flash and all those things. Chris Rock, he has nonverbal learning disorder, which is on the spectrum. And Daryl Hannah, of course, actress, and she is autistic as well. And she's also a very outspoken activist right now, and that is not coincidental, I don't think either. We tend to be whistleblowers and activists and people who are outspoken. Contrary to those stereotypes that I already ran down, many autistic people are very sensitive, perceptive, and detail-oriented. Many have intense hyper-empathy and appear unempathic because they're so flooded by other people's emotional feedback. Generally speaking, we tend to be less prone to biases than other people. We make fewer logical mistakes when we're given logic problems compared to non-autistic people. Again, that's because we're bottom-up processors. We don't take things for granted and we don't make assumptions. Generally speaking, non-autistic people, they use a lot of heuristics and rules of thumb to make quick snap judgments about how to navigate the world, which is very efficient. The human brain probably evolved to be super efficient for a reason, but when you're that efficient, you also are prone to prejudices and logical errors. And we tend to see less evidence of those biases in autistic people. We are sensitive to sensory input. We can be either sensory seekers or sensory avoiders, but both of those are ways of dealing with our bottom-up sensory processing style. Really intense, predictable sensations like being squeezed tight or hearing really loud, pounding, predictable music. Those things can be soothing to us in much the same way that being in a quiet room or being away from distracting, like tickly, uncomfortable stimuli can also be soothing to us. Those are both different ways of dealing with the same experience, which is bottom-up sensory processing. We are not all white cisgender boys. There are Black, brown, trans, and queer autistics, many autistic women as well, and gender nonconforming autistics. Generally, anybody who's marginalized, including people in poverty as well, they are far less likely to be diagnosed. And if they do get diagnosed, it's at a much later age because anyone in that population doesn't fit the stereotypes that psychiatrists have been fed and the media has fed all of us. Many of us, especially people who don't get diagnosed at the conventional age in early childhood, are instead, misdiagnosed as borderline, narcissistic, oppositionally defiant, bipolar, or OCD. PTSD gets in there as well. Especially, these are all true of Black autistic people and brown autistic people. Traits that in a white cisgender boy would be seen as sympathetic are often in non-white autistics seen as evidence of being a suspicious, untrustworthy person or a manipulative person. Anyone who's in that marginalized category often results in them heavily needing to mask their autistic traits. If all you know all your life is that people are treating you like you're a freak and you don't know what's going on and why that would be, you learn to inhibit yourself and fake qualities that will get people to like you or at least tolerate you. And consequently, we know that masking of autism is highly associated with a variety of psychological problems because pretending to be something you're not sucks. We have a very high risk of eating disorders, substance use disorders, self-harm, suicide risk, and relational problems, which also ties back to the borderline and narcissistic personality disorder, things like that. So what is masked autism? Masked autism is taking any steps necessary to camouflage or compensate for your disability so that people don't find out that you have a disability or so that people stop treating you like there's something wrong with you. Masking involves things like faking smiles and laughter, pretending you know what's going on, forcing yourself to make eye contact, memorizing normal sounding conversations and small talk from watching TV and imitating what you learned on TV, being very agreeable and fawning, so really being a people pleaser and doing everything you can to minimize conflict and to morph yourself into what people expect you to be based on the situation, because you know that your authentic self has never been treated as if it's a person worth loving or accommodating. Intense inhibition, as I've already mentioned. Often people mask their sensory issues by using substances, self-harm, or eating disorders to kind of blunt the daily continual pain that they're in from being out in public in a world that's too bright and too loud. life hacks and cutting corners in order to prop up the life that you have presenting as a neurotypical person. So cutting back on chores, socializing, hobbies, spending all of your free time just sleeping or in the dark to recharge your social batteries, because pretending to be someone you're not at work all day is so exhausting. Even things like pretending to know less about a subject than you actually do. We tend to be very passionate people. We have subjects and pursuits we get really into and obsessive about. And unfortunately, caring too much about something gets people treating you like you're a weirdo or a freak. And so many times we learn to just shut up entirely and pretend to not care about anything because we've always been told we care too much. Intense privacy and withdrawal, and just that, again, that existential dread of just never being known and never really getting to live as our true selves, or not even knowing who that true self is. All of these things are driven by the pressure to neuroconform. I've been talking a little bit about neurotypicals or non-autistic people. I've started in recent months in my own work avoiding the word neurotypical to refer to individual people. This is a statement from a psychiatrist, Dave Saunders, that was a comment on LinkedIn on a post that I made of an interview with me that really stayed with me and is really in line with my own personal views. Neurotypical standards are definitely a thing. We're all born into a world where we were expected to be neurotypical, but I don't know that there really is anyone who actually lives up to that ideal all the time, their whole life. So he really suggested this idea of talking instead about individuals having differing degrees of neuroconformity, and that really resonated with me. So neurotypical standards exist. We're all born being expected to be neurotypical, but is anybody actually served by there being one singular, narrow definition of how a person's supposed to think, feel, emote, communicate, and live? I don't think so. I don't think that that narrow, restricted definition actually serves anyone, or that anyone can really live up to it. So neuroconformity is really a social problem. Which leads into the next thing we'll be talking about, which is neurodiversity. So I'm sure you all have had plenty of time to kind of talk about the neurodiversity paradigm today. And that's just the idea that autism, ADHD, borderline, Tourette's, brain injuries, all of these things are just neutral sources of human diversity. They're just facts. Some people are that way. Some brains are just that way. And so we should be questioning what we can do as a society to better accommodate that full breadth of human diversity, rather than to cure it or prevent it from ever happening or ever appearing. The problem isn't located within the individual. The problem's located in a society that was not built for them and that excludes them over and over again. Neurodiversity is strongly linked to what's called the social model of disability, which applies to a variety of disabilities. And the idea behind the social model of disability is that, sure, there are some disabilities that are objectively medical conditions that a reasonable person with that condition would want to have it cured. You know, so one of my best friends from high school has spinal muscular atrophy. She loses muscle strength every year, and this condition, as it progresses, people sometimes die of it. So that's a medical condition, and if she could get that cured, I'm sure she would want to. I know she would want to. But there's a lot of other disabilities where the disabling isn't caused by the medical condition. It might not even be a medical condition. It's that society has disabled that person by excluding them over and over and over again. And this is certainly true of many aspects of being autistic. So for example, a lack of clear social communication disables us. The fact that people in most organizations and even in most friend groups don't say what they mean directly means I'm more socially disabled than if I lived in a world where people meant what they said and didn't use indirect cues, indirect questions, insincere questions, passive aggression, sarcasm, and etc. to communicate what they mean. If we just all were a little bit more literal and straightforward in our communication, autistic people would, in a very real sense, be less disabled than they are today. The same thing's true for sensory accommodations. In a world where we didn't all have painful fluorescent overhead lighting everywhere, I would be able to be in public more often for longer spans of time. I would be less irritable, I'd be less exhausted, I would function better, I would be less disabled. This is also true of if people would stop using speakerphone in public. If there's one takeaway, one practical takeaway I could give is please never use your speakerphone in public. It makes me want to die. It hurts so much. While we're talking about the neurodiversity and social model, it's always worth just touching on language briefly. I'm sure a lot of this stuff has already come up today. It's because of the social model of disability that most autistic people prefer identity first language. So autistic person or autistic rather than person with autism, handy capable, special needs, all these little euphemisms that are pretty condescending. Historically, those euphemisms were created by the non-disabled parents of disabled kids in the 80s, and then they were picked up by a lot of political organizations, again, led by non-disabled people. So the goal with these words was always to basically distance the disability from the person. Whereas if you don't think autism is a bad thing, if you think it's just totally neutral and fine, and just a naturally occurring source of human diversity, there's no need to separate that from a person's identity. It's not a bad thing to be autistic, so calling someone autistic is completely fine. It's when we treat it with like kid gloves and like we're afraid to touch it and acknowledge it that we're conveying that we think there's something shameful about it. And that's why this euphemistic language is, generally speaking, not preferred by people in the community. Everybody's different, so always ask the individual autistic person, and it's fine. If you describe yourself personally in a different way, I love that. I love that for you. But as a general rule, you want to avoid kind of using any language that might reflect discomfort or condescension for the community as a whole. Another way that we can kind of start thinking about neuroconformity and pushing against it is questioning what we've been taught about authenticity and being able to read people's faces and emotions. This is on the inside is a limited series on this podcast, Reply All, breaking down how a gentleman, Paul Madrowski, was sent to prison for murder, largely because the jury involved in his murder case didn't believe his testimony because he never made eye contact and he was behaving suspiciously. He was autistic. He was avoiding eye contact because it's intensely painful for him. But he was viewed as suspect and dangerous and sociopathic simply because as an autistic person, the way he expressed emotions looked different from how it does for non-autistic people. So really question, especially if you're here and you're not autistic, but autistic people too, because we still get this stuff drilled into us, what your stereotypes of authenticity are. And if you think a face-to-face real-time interaction with someone can somehow magically tell you if they're lying, what they're feeling, or what kind of person they are. Because I will tell you, because of masking, the person that I am when the average person meets me face to face, that's a huge difference than the person that I am at home or via email or when I'm alone and able to really sit and think about what my opinions and feelings are. And many autistic people will tell you the same, that we need time alone to reflect on how we're feeling and what our opinions are to be able to convey them. So any organizational structure that relies on face-to-face immediate feedback and meetings, you're going to lose a lot in translation. And also any job interview where you think you could tell whether someone's a good fit for a job role just based on the like social vibes that you get from them. That kind of approach, relying on intuition and social empathy in that way, is going to be in practice highly discriminatory to autistic people almost every time. Because the way that non-autistic people read us is very inaccurate. They're not good at reading our emotions and often see us as suspicious. There's a lot of research suggesting that autistic people are excellent at speaking up and naming what is happening in an organization, often without even meaning to. We just can't help but be honest. There's even some research showing that we make excellent whistleblowers, and that many whistleblowers in organizations that are doing unethical stuff, often the people who are brave enough to speak out and step away from the grain and cross that line and non-conform, they're often autistic people. Unfortunately, that means we tend to be punished for saying the unpopular truths, telling people at our workplaces things that they don't want to hear but that are true, or just answering a question honestly when somebody asked us that question, not wanting honesty. So that's another really important piece to keep in mind, especially talking about professional organizations and how we interact with others professionally. And again, even though you've had plenty of programming today talking about essential accommodations for making professional and academic spaces more comfortable for autistic people, this is another one that I just still wanted to really hammer home. Clear, literal, honest communication is absolutely essential to accommodating autistic people. You need to say what you mean. You can't drop hints. You can't use questions that are meant to score a rhetorical point. You can't use passive aggression. Autistic people, generally speaking, we are trying to pick up on these cues constantly, and it makes us very exhausted and often make us feel very paranoid because we're having to sift through all of these indirect cues, but it just does not come naturally to us. So saying what you mean and not punishing people for saying what they mean institutionally is just absolutely vital. And this accommodation does benefit everyone. The more straightforward you are in how you communicate, the better that is for other workers and colleagues who English isn't their first language, they're from a different subculture, they were raised different from you, they communicate different from you. There's a lot of reasons why people might express what they're thinking in a straightforward way and then be punished for it. Again, that's something that Black people in most organizations really suffer from. They're often discriminated against and treated as hostile just for saying a neutral fact. So moving towards a professional culture of literal, direct, honest communication is really a work of anti-racism as well as a work of neurodiverse justice. So that's always something I want to hammer home. And the kind of final couple of points I'll touch on before we get into your questions is zooming out of professional organizations or just the work you're doing in your libraries and your universities and thinking about what does, as a society, accommodating autistic people and disabled people. We are unemployed and underemployed at elevated rates. We are, generally speaking, many of us not good at job interviews. We're good at doing the actual work, but we're not good at doing the degree of lying that is expected at a job interview, but it's not exactly lying, but you're supposed to kind of buff the truth into a shine. Non-autistic people often intuitively know how to do it. It doesn't make sense to autistic people. And that is one of the many reasons why we tend to be unemployed and underemployed. Also, just the social stresses and exhaustion of a 9-to-5 workday in a fluorescently lit, loud, busy place means a lot of us have to do freelance or work from home because we just cannot sustain that level of masking and sensory discomfort for a full workday every single day. All of that means that we are financially incredibly vulnerable, especially if we're also a person of color, queer, trans, a woman, any marginalized group. From poverty in our family background, all of those things. That means we are at a heightened risk of homelessness, domestic abuse, because we can become financially dependent on a partner. And we are very easy to exploit. And unfortunately, even some organizations that talk about how can we accommodate autistic people, it's often with the view of, oh, they're so smart, they're so good at math, they're just like the good doctor, they're just like Rain Man, they're useful to us, and that's why we'll accommodate them. Which is very dehumanizing. And unfortunately, especially in tech, you see that kind of thinking a lot, that, oh, autistic people are good at math and tech, so we'll give them a little bit of leeway because they're useful to us, which is really insidious. So given the fact that we are so structurally marginalized, often multiply marginalized, what are the changes to our existing social structure that we need? And I build out the argument for why I believe, and many policymakers and autistic advocates believe, these things are needed. I get into that in more detail in the book. So if you're skeptical, maybe give the final chapter of the book a peek to see if I can persuade you. But here are some of the things I think we really need on a structural level and that we should all be pushing for politically. The end to at-will employment. In Canada, the rules might be a little bit different than the US, I think it's harder to fire people in Canada than the US. But here in the US, in most states, you can be fired at any time for any reason. So even though technically it's illegal to fire someone for being disabled, it's very easy to just say, this person isn't a fit in the culture of our organization, and then just fire someone for that. And unfortunately, I've seen that happen to many friends and colleagues of mine, where they wrote an email that was too long one time, and it struck a neurotypical or non-autistic person as too angry, even though they weren't angry, it was just the email was long. And so then they got fired for being hostile and not being a good organizational fit to the culture. So that's a really huge issue. Here in the US, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act. Of course, in Canada, you have parallel laws that have a lot of similarities. We need an expansion of disability protections. And in most countries that have a parallel to the ADA, because most countries, those laws rolled out at around the same time, again, in the 80s and early 90s. It's often really hard to prove discrimination legally. So even if you were fired, kicked out of your housing, kicked out of your school for being autistic, it's often really hard to prove that and to get justice. So we really need better policies in place to really help fund a disabled person pursue that kind of case, because it's really expensive typically to litigate that kind of stuff. As I already mentioned, autistic people, we are exploited for our labor and we are not treated well in the workplace, and most workplaces are hostile to us. So I believe what's good for the average worker tends to be good for autistic people. So I am a big advocate for labor unions, collective bargaining, the great resignation that we're seeing in the US and Canada and England and many other places. Workers generally coming together and saying, I'm not going to do these 60-hour work weeks for less pay and fewer benefits. I'm not going to be doing more for less anymore. We're done with this. We're going to keep our work from home. We're going to keep our flex time. Can't put that genie back in the bottle after the pandemic has loosened it out. So that kind of collective work amongst all workers joining forces, not just autistic people, I think has a lot of power to benefit autistic people and other disabled people. In the US, in Canada, in England, in lots of places, even though you guys do have a better healthcare system than us, it's still the case that it's really hard to get benefits or get a diagnosis as an autistic person. It can take years and you can get turned away just for being a woman or just being a person of color. I hear these stories all the time. So we really need expanded, perhaps universal basic income, expanded healthcare access that doesn't rely on proving that you're autistic through a really scrutinizing medical and psychiatric system that was designed for, again, just those white autistic cisgender boys, and everyone else kind of falls through the cracks. Conservatorships, I'm sure most people are familiar with kind of the Britney Spears case, which is just a high profile example of how disabled people have their rights taken away from them, and have their autonomy taken away from them if they do anything that's strange. You know, I don't know that Britney's autistic, but it's an example of how someone behaving oddly means they're stripped of their autonomy. I also believe that neurodiverse justice hinges on prison abolition and abolition of the police. I understand that might seem really extreme for some people. You might not be where I'm at on that. This is something that that's where I'm at after many years of researching and thinking about it and talking with abolitionists. 50% of all people shot by the police in the US have a disability. Many of the high profile police killings of Black people in my country, they had some kind of disability or neurodivergence. So these things are inextricably linked. And we do know that's a big part of why Black autistic people have a increased pressure to mask their disability, is because, you know, if I'm walking down the street flapping my hands, people might stare at me, but that's the worst thing that's going to happen. If I were a Black autistic man walking down the street doing that, I could get incarcerated for it. So that's why I believe these things are inextricably linked. As well as, again, some of the socioeconomic factors that play into who gets arrested and why, and the fact that autistic people are, you know, homeless, unemployed, financially vulnerable at elevated rates. So those are things I think we need to all be thinking about if we're really taking the long view of what neurodiverse justice is. So that is my very long discussion of these topics. If you'd like to learn more, I have a lot of free writing on my Medium blog. It's free to read. There's the URL. The Autistic Self-Advocacy Network has chapters throughout the world, including in most major cities in Canada. The blog Real Social Skills is also a really incredible resource. The book Disability Visibility by Alice Wong, which she also has a podcast, is incredible and very intersectional of many disabilities. And then also I'm a huge fan of the blog and the YouTube series Ask an Autistic by Amethyst Shaver, who is a trans Métis neurodivergent person in Canada. So highly recommend all of those. So again, thank you so much for everyone for having me here and sitting through this. I'm sure it's been a really long day, and I'm sure there were some redundancies in what I talked about, looking at all the excellent programming that you had today. But thank you again for having me. And I think we can dive into questions, right, with the time we have remaining, or?
We can. Thank you, Devin.